Look at how empty this schedule is. So notice we've got a lecture period on Monday and Wednesday and an exam period on Friday. Your exam will be entirely online and will be taken at the time of your normal lecture period. Notice that these periods are mandatory and that you should be watching the lecture prior to actually having come. So my goal with this is that you do the studying beforehand and that helps you learn the materials beforehand so that we can just reinforce them in lecture periods, and then ultimately we won't really need to, or you won't need to do as much studying outside of class. Also note that we've got chapter 43 here and then bits of chapter 44 and 45. I've cut out 47. Unfortunately, we won't get to that this year. Note too that this Thursday, the 3rd, we've got a mandatory lab period. During this, I want to do some writing workshop stuff as well as some course eval stuff. So do expect to come to lab this day. It'll be online, but I do want you there. We're going to finish up behavior today. We began to introduce innate and learned behaviors on Wednesday. We've got communicative behaviors and then ultimately behaviors that contribute to fitness. So you should be able to define different types of behaviors based on what shapes them. You should be able to design an experiment that differentiates between learned and innate behaviors. You should be able to describe disadvantages and advantages to communicating using different senses or sensory modalities. We're going to talk about fitness, what it means, and you should be able to describe behaviors that contribute to fitness. You should be able to define altruism and explain why true altruism is difficult to find in the animal kingdom. And then finally, I want you to know what inclusive fitness and kin selection are and explain how they fit into behavioral ecology. Now, take note of these learning goals. As you watch this lecture, actually take time to figure out what you're trying to learn in the lecture, and maybe you even want to write them down, and as you go, jot notes down. So at the end of the lecture, then you can review these learning goals and ask yourself, all right, how well can I accomplish each of these? So on Wednesday, we began our behavioral ecology unit. This is chapter 43, and I really highly encourage you to read your book. I know some of you haven't been keeping up with your book, but keeping up with your book is going to reinforce the concepts I'll be testing you on, and it'll also just enrich your biological foundation. So ecology is the study of interactions among organisms in their environment, and then behavior is going to be any action by an animal that can be observed and described. So you could imagine that most behaviors would fall under this umbrella of ecology. That is, most behaviors will be organisms interacting with their environment, with each other, or between species. On Wednesday, we discussed the fact that behaviors can be inborn or innate. Notice the root here, like natal or nativity, inborn. So these are part of an animal's nature. It's really written into their genetic code. And you can end up with some pretty complex innate behaviors in animals. For example, birds building their nests, most of that behavior is going to be innate. And the example I gave you was this Taylor bird here. You can Google this and find this video. Just phenomenal stuff. They can take fibers from their environment and actually sew leaves together to create a nest. Even really small insects can have pretty complex innate behaviors. For example, these leafcutter ants that work together to create really intricate designs to their nests. We discussed humans having innate behaviors. Ones that you came up with were crying, suckling, sleeping, blinking, reflexes. And some of these innate behaviors will even be present in utero before animals are born or hatched. So this fetus is sucking its thumb. It's thought that this behavior might help to strengthen the sucking muscles that it'll need as a newborn so that it can effectively nurse. Now, on the other side of that spectrum, we've got behaviors that can be learned. So I think you guys are familiar with learning, but I want to show you a couple things. First, you can have really basic animals that still learn. These planarians, if you remember, their nervous system is basically just a nerve net. They don't really have much for ganglia or cephalization, a little bit maybe, but it's pretty diffuse, their nervous system. Yet they can still learn. And actually in my Bio 201 class, I got to do an experiment where we had these planarians and watched them learn. Basically, we would poke them with a stick until they stopped responding. And that habituation is basically them figuring out, okay, the stimulus is going to come all the time. I am not going to need to respond to it because it's not killing me. I'm just going to put up with being poked with this stick for now. So that habituation is a form of learning, and we can see this even in really simple organisms with very simple nervous systems. Some organisms have something called insight learning, and this is really only in organisms that have a little bit more complex nervous system and more capability to learn. Insight learning is when an organism learns something based on experiences from other individuals, or sort of puts two and two together rather than actually learning from stimuli it receives itself. So you might have seen this in the news a while back. There was a dog somewhere in Latin America that saw children paying for treats and then getting a treat after they handed the cashier a paper bill. And so this dog, seeing that, decided, well, if I take leaves, which are kind of like paper, and hand them to the cashiers, maybe they'll give me a treat as well. Regardless of the complexity, many organisms can learn. So these learned behaviors are going to be part of an organism's nurture. Basically, their environment shapes their behavior, and we call that learning, or part of an organism's nurture. So we have several different types of learned behaviors. Now, before we go into these, I should define learning. So this is really going to be any durable change in behavior by experience. So those planarians, when we poked them, we saw a durable change in their behavior. They stopped responding by their experience being poked by a stick multiple times. Same with that dog. The durable change was the fact that it was now trying to get its food by using the exchange system that it had observed in humans. So any durable change in behavior by experience is going to be learning. Now, a couple special types of learning are encompassed by this term associative learning. Basically, associative learning is when an organism associates two different events and the result is a behavioral change in response to only one of them. Let me give you a couple examples of this. So one type of associative learning is classical conditioning. You might not know this term, but my guess is that many of you will have at least heard of a classical example of this. This is basically when two stimuli are often paired and the stimulus of one results in an involuntary response that should normally be to the other. The classical example of this is Pavlov's dog. So what Pavlov did, Pavlov was a famous psychologist back in the, I think, 20th century. What Pavlov did is he basically rang a bell every time he fed his dogs. And eventually the dogs learned to associate the bell ringing with getting fed. And he could get them to salivate more, even when he just rang the bell without having the food present. So these two stimuli, the presence of food and the ringing of the bell, resulted in a response that was involuntary because the dogs learned to associate the stimuli with each other. Another type of associative learning is called operant conditioning. And this is maybe the conditioning or the training that you're more familiar with. So operant conditioning is when a response to a stimulus is strengthened via a reward or punishment system. And this response is usually voluntary. So with operant conditioning, you might be familiar with how you train your dog. Basically, you give your dog a reward or punish him when he does something bad or good, respectively. And when you do, that response to a stimulus is strengthened. So as an example, maybe you want your dog to respond to you twirling your finger in a circle by rolling over. And so when you twirl your finger in a circle, and when your dog responds to that twirling a finger in a circle to actually rolling over, then you give him a treat. And so the stimulus is you twirling your finger, the response by the dog is actually rolling over, and it's strengthened by a reward or a punishment. So in the same way, it's associating a stimulus with a response. So both of these are types of associative learning. One is strengthening the response to a stimulus, and one is pairing two different stimuli. A cool example of this operant conditioning is being used by groups like TSA, or the Department of Homeland Security. Basically, they're trying to figure out better ways to sniff out drugs and bombs at airports. And they figured out that bees actually have really good sniffers. And they can train bees to stick out their tongue, their proboscis, when they smell certain scents. So let's say a bee is trained to smell cocaine. Basically, they would let the bee smell cocaine, and when it did, if it stuck out its tongue, there would be sugar waiting at the end of that tongue, so that the stimulus, cocaine, resulted in a response sticking out the tongue that was strengthened by a reward, which was the sugar. So just like you can train your dog, you can actually train bees. And this is another example of how we can use learning in animals to accomplish our goals. Another type of learning is called imprinting, and this is also a response to a stimulus, but rather than this being strengthened by some sort of a reward like operant conditioning, a type of associative learning, imprinting is going to be something that's pretty genetically hardwired into animals. So the imprinting, the response to the stimulus, isn't hardwired, but their propensity or their likelihood of developing this response is somewhat ingrained into their developmental timeline. So as an example, the first thing that a duck or a duckling sees and hears when it is hatched, it will very strongly imprint on that, thinking it's its mother. And you could imagine how this would help the duckling in the long run. Typically, the only thing that it's going to see and hear is its mother or its nestmates. And so if the goal of the duckling is to constantly be by the mother where it's going to get protection, it would be valuable for that duckling to imprint on its mother. So basically, there's a critical period in this duckling's life. It's something within like a day or two after it's hatched to something like a week or 2 weeks after it's hatched, during which it will very strongly form a response to the stimulus that it receives the most. So this happens in ducklings. This is another thing I got to do in undergrad. Basically, in our ecology and behavior class, we hatched out ducklings and then kept them in isolation, except for when we were going to imprint them. So my group actually imprinted them on a tennis ball. Basically, we would put the duckling in an arena and pull a tennis ball around, and eventually that duckling learned to follow that tennis ball like it's following this cat here. Another form of imprinting that you might have heard is salmon. So salmon will, soon after they're hatched, imprint on the chemical signature of the water that they're hatched in. So it's during a critical period in development, and they form a very strong response to that stimulus. So later in life, that chemical imprinting will tell them what stream to go to spawn in their natal hatching grounds. So we've discussed some types of innate behaviors and learned behaviors, and what I want you to think about right now is how can you tell the difference between a learned behavior and an innate behavior. Pause the video here and just maybe jot some ideas. How could you actually empirically test or experimentally test whether a behavior is learned or innate? I'm going to go through a few examples of this in a moment, so pause it, jot down your ideas now, and then I'll go through a couple with you. And on Monday, it's likely that we'll actually discuss this exact question. So in order to test whether something is controlled by genetics, you need to manipulate or change the genetics of your experimental groups. In order to do that, you need to only manipulate those genetics, and therefore you need to control for the environment. So by only having the genetics be the difference between your experimental groups, and by keeping everything else constant, including the environment, you can then test if a difference in behavior results from the genetic differences, because we've now controlled for the environment. Let me give you an example. So we've got two populations of garter snakes, one from inland California and one from coastal California. So these, by being different populations, are likely to have different genetics. So we've manipulated or we've changed the genetics of our two treatment groups. We also know that these guys have different behaviors. The inland garter snake doesn't really eat slugs. It focuses on fish, aquatic crayfish, maybe small insects. But the coastal garter snake primarily eats slugs, and from what I'm told, these guys taste pretty noxious. I haven't eaten one of these like I did the earthworms, but I've heard they're pretty nasty. So they've got different behaviors as far as their eating, and what we want to figure out is that behavior due to genetics? So we need to change the genetics, or really just have two treatments that have different genetics, and we're controlling for their environment. Now I want to show you here, on this graph we've got the percentage of snakes and their tongue flicks per minute. So a tongue flick is thought to be like a response to the stimulus of the scent of their preferred prey. So notice that we have many more snakes flicking their tongue when they're given a stimulus of the scent of slugs in the coastal population than in the inland population. Let me say that again. This is the tongue flicks per minute in response to that slug stimulus, and the percentage of snakes that flicks their tongue is much lower in the inland population than the coastal population. So inland snakes typically eat frogs and fish, coastal snakes eat slugs, and we see a difference in the behavior already. And now we want to know whether or not this was due to genetics or environment. So one way that you can control for environment here is to just look at the behavior of newly hatched snakes. If they just hatched, they won't have any experience with their world, they won't have any nurture. And so any difference we can see, we can be reasonably confident that that difference is going to be due to genetic differences rather than learned or environmental differences. So the genetic difference is likely causing this difference in behavior, which is likely due, which they figured out with further research, that this is because they have different abilities to taste those nasty chemicals from the slugs. So by controlling for the environment, in this case just looking at animals that hadn't really had any experience with their environment, we were able to see that the difference in behavior was likely due to genetic differences because we had two treatment groups that had different genetics. Now, if we control for genetics but change the environment, this is one way that we might be able to test if a behavior is due to nurture or something that the animal learned. So whatever we're switching between treatment groups, that's what we're testing for. And in order to do that, we need to control all other factors, in this case, genetics. So one way that scientists have done this is that they've actually taken songbirds and removed them from their home nest and then transplanted them into the same species nest, but a far ways away. And in some songbirds, we actually see differences in their song based on region. They might have similar songs, but we'll see enough of a difference by region that we could wonder, well, maybe that difference is because parents are teaching their offspring. It could be due to environment or learning, or it could be due to different genetic stock in different regions, kind of like we saw in the garter snakes. So if we're asking, does the song that a songbird sings result from something it learns or something that is genetically born into them, we can run this type of test. We're controlling for genetics by taking eggs from the same nest, from the same parents, and we're transplanting some of them into a new environment. So we're manipulating the environment the egg experiences. What scientists have figured out with this is that often a songbird's song is actually fairly well learned from its parent. So when you transplant them to a totally different population, those songbirds are more likely to sing the song of their parents, of their adoptive parents, than their biological parents, meaning that they're learning it, and that much of that song is going to be due to the environment, the learning that they experience, rather than their genetic stock. So I've just described to you two experiments, one in which we controlled for the environment and tested the differences of different genetic stock, the other in which we controlled for genetics and tested the effect of the environment on behavior. And you should be able to design an experiment like that for your exam. Now, can these behaviors be both nurture and? You probably know already, yes. Like, we've got behaviors that are inborn into us, but you can sort of learn to change them, or they can be shaped by our environment as well. So a really cool experiment that tested this in animals has to do with starlings. So this is the European starling, and basically scientists wanted to figure out if their migrating patterns were inborn into them, if they were genetic, or if they were learned, if they were due to, the environment that the starlings experienced. So I should point out right now, when I say environment, that really means anything the starling experiences, and not just like the temperature, the environmental conditions, and that kind of thing. So what they did is they basically took migrating starlings, which would have been coming from the breeding range to their overwintering range. They collected them in the Netherlands and then transplanted them to Sweden. So if this is entirely genetic, maybe those starlings would just be following the westerly course that they can identify from the sun, and they would end up in Spain. But if it's learned, maybe they would have some other homing cue that they would have learned by coming back from their wintering range. So what they saw then is that initially, at least with the inexperienced starlings, so the yearlings from that year, when they were transplanted to Switzerland, those starlings ended up in Spain. This indicates that migrating behavior is initially an innate response. It's something genetically imprinted into them. But what they also learned is that the experienced starlings, the starlings that had made this trip back and forth once already, were more likely to end up in their wintering range. So this tells the scientists that there's some sort of learned component after they've been there once that allows the starlings to home back into their wintering range. And this might be like magnetic cues or some sort of angle of the sun cue, but in general, starlings have an innate response that can be shaped by learning as well. So this is an example of a behavior that is both learned and innate. So this raises the question then, do you think that we are more controlled by our genetics or more by our environment? And what do you think about a housefly, more controlled by its genetics or by its environment? I want you to think about this, jot down some responses, and we'll discuss this on Monday. So, moving on to a different type of behavior, or a different way we can classify behavior. We just talked about learned and innate traits, or learned and innate behaviors. And communication can be both innate and learned. But communication serves a very specific purpose. It allows us to interact with other individuals of our species and sometimes beyond our species as well. We're going to learn a few different types of communication, but the general definition here is that a communication is an action by a sender that influences the behavior of the receiver. Now, this communication doesn't have to be intentional. An organism can have some sort of action that influences another's behavior regardless of whether it intends to communicate something to that individual or not. For example, if you're talking to someone you are attracted to, it is basically scientific fact that your pupils will dilate. And that pupil dilation is not really something you're intending to do, but it can influence the behavior of the receiver. The behavior of the receiver, and the receiver might not even know it, but they're more likely to sort of recognize A, that you might be attracted, or B, find you more attractive as well based on those bigger pupils. Now, communication can involve multiple sensory modalities. And let's bold, italics, underline these guys so that you should know these. So a sensory modality is basically a different type of sense. So tactile or touching, vision or eyesight, auditory, hearing, those are three sensory modalities. Chemoreception is a sensory modality. You can imagine that we humans use many of these. So you might be trying to influence the behavior of someone you're romantically interested in by using cologne. You might talk on a phone using the auditory sensory modality. You might use a visual cue by trying to hail a taxi cab here. In the animal kingdom, we see all of these different modalities as well. And each of these modalities will have kind of pros and cons to using them. So what I want you to do here is pause this, make a list of the different types of communication, and then also make a list of things that you think are advantages or disadvantages to using these three types of communication. And I want to point out, it's going to be really tempting to just go on without even thinking about this, but forcing yourself to do the uncomfortable stuff and actually think about this before you move on is going to help you in the long run, because you form neural circuitry when you actually do the hard work and think about things rather than passively just digest them. So make that list, check it twice, and see if you can come up with pros and cons to using auditory communication, visual communication, or chemical communication. Just a note, there's more types of communication here. You can do tactile communication, like tasting communication even happens in some cases, but we're only going to discuss these three. So with chemical communication, a few advantages to using chemicals is that a little might go a long way. This Polyphemus moth, I would have to look. This might not be a Polyphemus, but it's in the same family. But this moth is going to have excellent chemical communication. The females can secrete just very little pheromone, and the male can pick that up from up to a mile away. So that signal might last a long time too, especially if it's not a very volatile signal. So for example, this cheetah marking its territory on this tree, a signal there might actually last a while. You can imagine that's different from a noise you make, or if you're a firefly, a light that you flash. Another benefit to this is some of these can be very species specific. So by having a very species-specific pheromone cue, this moth might avoid being eaten by not letting every potential predator smell it. And these chemicals are going to work day and night. You don't need any light present in order to allow that to work. One of the detriments to using chemical communication is if you're trying to attract mates, or if you're relying on the dissemination of wind to, or the ability of wind to disseminate that cue, you might be at the wind of the weather. Deer hunters take advantage of this by trying to play deer downwind of them. And yeah, basically, if you're a polyphemus moth trying to attract a mate in one forest and the wind is blowing the wrong direction, you might be sorry out of luck. Another potential detriment to these chemical cues is that they might not be readily changed. So you might not have much complexity or much capacity to actually send out different signals if you've just got one or two chemicals produced. Ants actually get around this a little bit by having several glands that produce different pheromones that mean different things in different concentrations. You're probably more familiar with auditory communication because this is something that we humans are really adept at. Advantages, it's quick. You can just let out something, some sort of sound, and people hear it right away. That sound travels quickly. This one also works day and night. Sounds might travel long distances and they might not. So I put this in the pro category because some sounds will travel long distances. Whales will actually emit almost like infrasound, or many large animals will emit infrasound that travels long distances. But if you got certain sound producing organs like a mosquito's wings, that sound isn't going to travel more than, well, a few centimeters or maybe a meter. And so the distance that sound travels is going to depend on a lot of different things. Often, sounds can be easily modified for complexity, but this is going to depend on the organism. So organisms with more developed voice boxes or larynxes are going to be better at modifying those sounds. One of the cons to auditory communication is that it will often be, or it can be very easily drowned out. So if you're curious, you should Google the cocktail party effect. This is something that it discusses more of an issue in like human behavior and our ability to selectively hear, but it sort of applies to animals too. If you've ever been to for example, a rainforest at night or a coral reef, it's actually pretty loud and there's a lot of sound going on. And you might have one particular sound, but if it gets drowned out by all the other sound, well, you might be sorry out of luck as well. Moving on to visual communication. So, using visual communication can be discrete. Basically, you might have good control over who's actually seeing it because you're not just broadcasting, for example, a chemical pheromone or a sound to everything in the forest. In the case of this Anolis lizard, you might just be flashing your dewlap at a potential mate. But not everybody's going to see that unless they're specifically looking at you. Because it's just the behaviors of light, these also can travel long distances. But also because it's just the behaviors of light, these might only work diurnally, that is, during the day. If you're producing your own light like this firefly, that won't be the case, but you can imagine this dewlap isn't going to do much good if your mate can't see it at night. And again, sound tends to bounce off things. Chemicals tend to waft around corners, but photons, they really are limited by what obstructs them. So if you're in a crowded forest, you might only be able to send that signal as far as, well, maybe 10 meters or so, or something like that, because all the trees would get in the way. Now, with any of these, you are likely, or the animal is likely intending for another organism of its own species to receive the communication and act on it. Often this is to sound alarms or maybe more frequently to try to attract mates. The problem with any communication is that sometimes it can be usurped by the wrong receiver. So as an example, this frog, I'm not sure if this is the actual species, but there's a species of frog in the Panamanian rainforest called a tungara frog. And it's called that because it makes a sound that basically says that, at least in whoever named it. It sounds like this. Tungara. It's got this like chirp, this whistle and then a chirp at the end. And bats will often hone in on that chirping, or excuse me, home in on that chirping noise. And when they do, they can actually find these frogs, and there's a specific species of frog-eating bat that will just chow down on them. So in the presence of bats, or if a bat's calling, these frogs will actually drop that chirp off of off of the end of their call in order to try to not get eaten even as they're trying to attract mates with that call. Some fireflies actually eat other fireflies, and they'll home in on fireflies that are flashing their lights. Usually that's to attract mates, but if you're the firefly eating type of firefly, you might simply be homing in on someone else's communication and using that to find your prey. So any form of communication could potentially be picked up by the wrong party. This is debated. I think it's fascinating. So we are very good at communicating visually and auditorially with hearing and sound. Do we communicate chemically? There's actually been some studies that suggest yes. It's still a little bit it's a little bit tough to control for all potential confounding variables, and so there's debate about this in the literature and among behavioral biologists, but it's likely that we do have certain chemical cues, certain pheromones that signal to potential mates. We'll talk about one of these, and if I don't remember to talk about it on Monday, you should remind me, but I'll try to talk about one of these on Monday. All right, finally, we are getting into the portion of this lecture that discusses fitness. And before I unblank this out, we should define what fitness is. This is one of those things that you'll run across different definitions, but generally it's agreed that fitness, at least in an ecological context, is the ability of an organism to pass its genes to the next fertile generation. So notice that you're passing on your genes and that your offspring or the organisms that have your genes are also able to do so. So then, we've got lots of behaviors that can increase our fitness. And really, most behaviors in the animal kingdom will ultimately be working towards increasing that animal's fitness in some way or another, either in a big way or in a small way. I should also note that every behavior and every trait is going to come at a cost. So in ecology, we call this the principle of allocation. Basically, you can't be good at everything, and you need to allocate your behavioral effort as well as your energy into different bins in order to maximize how many genes you pass on to that next fertile generation in order to maximize your fitness. So, some behaviors that we see are territorial behaviors. You might have a troop of monkeys that vigorously defends a tree that has really nutritious fruit coming into maturity, into ripeness. So territorial behavior might try to give you better access to food or water. It might also give you better access to mates. So if you deer hunt, you might have seen a buck rub or a buck scrape, and bucks will often engage in these territorial behaviors basically to mark their own territory on which they'll, at least ideally if you're the buck, be able to mate as many does as are on that patch of ground. Sometimes this territorial behavior incurs damage due to fighting. So you could imagine a warring troop of monkeys trying to infringe on their territory, and if they end up fighting, well, that fight might end up posing a risk to the monkeys. So often there'll be a balance between the benefits and the risks associated with defending a territory. Same with deer. You might end up fighting another buck over your territory, and if you do, you might win, but you might also incur some damage, and so there's going to be a risk associated with defending a territory, but ideally the reward favors or outweighs the risk. Another type of behavior that increases fitness is foraging. This is basically animals' investment in the collection of energy. If everything comes at a cost and everything costs energy, you're going to want to collect as much energy as possible, as much food, nutrition, etc. And in general, just like defending territory has benefits and risks, collecting energy can also come with risk as well. Imagine you're a squirrel collecting nuts. You're going to be at some risk of being picked off by a hawk while you're on the ground. So in general, we also see a balance of energy ingested versus the risk of actually collecting that energy in animals. Now, if fitness is the ability to pass on your genes to the next fertile generation, you could imagine that sexual behaviors are hugely tied to fitness, and there's a whole field of sexual ecology and understanding sexual selection. There's a lot of really cool biology that goes on when it comes to these sexual behaviors and sexual conflict, and I don't have time to get into a lot of them here, but to prepare you for ecology, I want to give you just a few terms that you should know. So, with these terms, I'm going to give you 4 of them, and I want you to note that if you know the Greek and think about it logically, this will really help you understand what the terms are. So many of you probably already know the words monogamy or monogamous and polygamy, polygamous. This means one mate or literally one union, and this means multiple mates or multiple unions. So mono, one, poly, many. And gamy, that's actually the same root as gamete. So gametes join together in a union to fertilize and ultimately become a zygote. Gamy is going to be union or mate. Now, depending on whether the female is mating with multiple or one male, or if the male is mating with multiple or one female, we've got different terms for this. So polyandry is going to be a female that mates with multiple mates or multiple males. Multiple, poly, and andry, male. If you know the term android, that means like man, or it's like a term for a robotic man. Androgynous means male, female. Androgenic steroids are steroids that make someone into more of a masculine person. So females that mate with multiple males are polyandrous. Before I go on, I should describe this lion here. So female lions will actually mate with multiple males in their estrus cycle. Sometimes it's up to 50 matings a day, and it's thought that the reason for that is so that the males don't know who's the dad of those children, and so they have equal investment in keeping those children alive in that lion pride. When females typically only mate with one male, monandry, we call this monandry or monandrous. So this female mosquito is usually monandrous. She only mates once in her life. Males that mate with multiple females, multiple, poly, gyne or ginny, females. So think of like gynecologist is a female reproductive doctor. So males that mate with multiple females are polygynous. And so an example of this can be seen in a lot of our deer populations where the largest deer will maintain a harem of females with which he mates. When males mate with only one female, this is called monogynous or monogeny. So one mono, gyne or ginny female. So widow spiders sometimes are monogynous, meaning the male will mate with the female and then the female might eat the male afterwards. This won't always occur, but it does happen sometimes. And so this is an example of where we would see monogeny in the wild. So to be clear here, these terms only describe one sex's behavior. So polyandry and monandry only describe the female's behavior. It doesn't describe what the males are doing. In the case of lions, these male lions would also be polygamous or polygynous. In the case of the females, the males are also going to be polygynous. They are not going to be monogynous. So polyandry and monandry refer to females, polygyny and monogeny refer to males. You can get some really awesome sexual behaviors, and I just had to show you this video. If you're not familiar with this video or this bird, you should Google this. This is one of the birds of paradise, and it's got this incredible mating display as well as these incredible secondary feathers that have colors that are meant to kind of mesmerize a female. And often in these mating displays, we see some really ridiculous characteristics. So in general, natural selection that's based on sexual characteristics is called sexual selection. And one of the best examples of this is the peacock that has these enormous feathers that should actually make him die more. But because he's able to get more mates with a more elaborate feather display, it actually kind of balances the risk-reward in his favor. Even though he's more likely to be eaten by a predator with these ridiculous feathers, he's better at obtaining mates. And so the overall fitness advantage that he gets with these awesomely beautiful feathers outweighs the risk of being eaten more. The question of why a female would choose that in the first place is kind of an interesting one, and I'll let you ponder that one. The final behavior I want to talk about, or type of behavior, is altruism. And if you know this from just everyday speech, altruism is basically selflessness. It's giving up something of your own without any expectation of a return on investment. Basically, I do something for you without the expectation of you do something for me. I scratch your back without the expectation of you scratching mine. There's no quid pro quo. So, in animal behavior, you might define this as a behavior that decreases your own lifetime reproductive success, but benefits another. Or benefits the species as a whole, maybe. You'll find different definitions of this in animal behavior. And basically, this altruism somewhat poses a paradox, because if behaviors are shaped by natural selection, and natural selection favors behaviors that allow you to pass your own genes on, you shouldn't ever do something that's nice for another animal, because that would essentially be reducing your ability to pass your own genes on and allowing someone else to pass their genes on. But we see these types of behaviors in certain cases. So one prime example is in eusocial insects, basically the bees, or many bees and many ants and many wasps. In those eusocial insects, you'll often have one queen and a whole sterile cast of other females that never reproduce, but do everything they can to help that queen reproduce. And so this raises the question, why should these sterile females give up all of their reproduction for the benefit of the queen. And the answer to this paradox, at least in animal behavior, seems to best be resolved by the idea of inclusive fitness and kin selection. So inclusive fitness is a definition of fitness that is passing on of your genes to the next generation, both by direct reproduction, but also by the reproduction of animals that are related to you. So the theory goes, if natural selection is acting on genes that form behaviors, and your relatives share some of your genes, when your relative reproduces, that's essentially him or her passing on some of your genes to the next generation, even though you didn't do it yourself. So if you can do something that helps your relative pass on their genes, then you might actually be gaining some fitness yourself. So this type of natural selection is called kin selection. Basically, it's selection that favors you helping your kin because they're related to you and share some of your genes, and because natural selection is actually happening at the level of the gene and not necessarily the level of the individual. So in the case of these ants, all of these sterile females will be getting inclusive fitness by helping their mother reproduce future queens. So the queens and the drones, the males, are really the ones that pass on their genes, and the sterile caste just benefits by sharing some of their genes with those reproductive castes. We also see a similar phenomenon in some birds, and well, other animals as well, but basically sometimes there will be crows or other species of bird that will be helpers at the nest. They might not reproduce, even though they're sexually mature, they might decide to stay at their parents' nest and bring food into their offspring. And the theory goes that by helping their parent reproduce siblings, they might be able to garner some of their own inclusive fitness. And so kin selection will enable or will reinforce the behaviors that cause them to forego some of their own fitness but help their parents. It's thought that typically we see this happen when those young birds wouldn't have much reproductive success on their own. So for example, they might not be good at finding mates or securing optimal nest locations, but if they stay at home and help their parents raise their siblings, they might get a little bit of inclusive fitness in sort of compensation for foregoing their own reproduction. Now, they're not like making a deal with their parents, obviously. This is all just behaviors that are thought to be shaped by kin selection. So as it turns out, altruistic behavior, in the absence of inclusive fitness and kin selection, seems to be pretty rare in the animal community. And one example of this that has been described is in vampire bat colonies, where individuals will end up actually helping each other out in the colony, even though they might be unrelated. Now, when they do, a little bit about vampire bats first. Basically, they have a really high metabolism, and they'll forage at night trying to find an animal from which they can suck their blood. So they'll take this massive blood meal and then bring it back to the colony. They're not all that successful all the time. Often they'll end up not being successful in finding someone to forage on, and when that happens, they come back to the colony starving. And because they've got a high metabolism, if you only get a blood meal every now and then, you might be good for a while, but as soon as you go a few days without a blood meal, you would essentially starve. So you've got this feast or famine lifestyle, and basically what this means is that vampire bats benefit by sharing with each other because it makes the availability of your food as a colony more consistent. That is, if you would typically go a few days without food, you might be able to depend on your colony mates by letting them feed you a little bit of their blood meal. So their colony mates will actually regurgitate the blood meal up, part of it, and they'll feed each other. And by doing that, they sort of make the whole feeding regime of the colony more consistent, and it means they're less likely to starve because they don't have these famine periods. So even though they might be unrelated, they engage in these behaviors, and you might think this is really selfless of them, but actually it turns out there seems to be a scorekeeping strategy. Basically, there seems to be a quid pro quo in this scenario. So you might call this altruism. You might call it reciprocal altruism because they're scratching each other's backs rather than having one selfless individual. Because there's a scorekeeping strategy, if you don't share very often, you're actually more likely to be excluded in this sharing of food, and therefore you actually put yourself at risk of starving. So it benefits each individual in the colony to be willing to share because it essentially ensures that your colony mates will share with you later on. So altruism seems to be pretty rare in the animal community, at least the type where you don't expect something back. I think this is kind of cool because we humans, we're actually different. We actually do see altruism even when there's no expectation of something in return. So it's true, all of our righteous acts are like filthy rags, and even when we do good things, often there's a slight selfish motive behind them. For example, the humble brag, or someone helping the needy but then posting about it on Facebook. Basically, you could argue that some of those righteous acts are done with the intent of looking good in the face of others. We are called to avoid that mentality. It's never going to be possible to fully purge ourselves of that mentality, at least here on earth. But I was just reading this morning, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. So, be altruistic. Do things even though you expect nothing in return. And God will reward us. Now, you might be saying, well, if we expect God to reward us, then is it truly altruism? Well, I'm not going to get into the nuances of that, but we are called to do good things without expecting anything or any accolades from men. So, do good things, help each other out, be altruistic. And that's all I have for you today. We're going to pick up with ecology next lecture.